Yeah, we'll go through the monoculture species real quick, but then we'll kind of come out here and look where the grazing occurred. First off, we have here is Willow Creek wheat. If you look at your sheets, Willow Creek is a northern variety. It was developed in Montana. One of the few wheats that haven't been bred to be a dwarf or semi-dwarf, and that's a big thing when we start looking at cover crops. We're really after that root system, not just biomass up top, but the root system. A lot of people, probably one of the most common questions I get in the South is, well, can I just use wheat as a cover crop? And you can. It makes a great cover crop. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're really after organic matter and building the soil and getting that root system, we tend to look at things that haven't been bred out for grain production, because we took a lot of that residue away. When we took that residue away, we took a lot of that root system away. So Willow Creek is one that's been bred more for forage, a little higher biomass. It is a beardless variety. It's also going to be one of your later species. So if you're looking at the grazing aspect, having staggered species and staggered maturity, we can balance that animal's diet a lot better. But it also gets you through some of those gaps. Say if you have winter wheat that's maturing out, or rye or triticale, it's maturing out 3 weeks early. If you have something that's more later maturity to get you up until your warm season grasses come on. So that's something that we would utilize in that scenario. Obviously we have monoculture strips here, but we're really about diversity today. This is just really for our identification. So you have anything to add to that? Or
if you give me an opening, you're not going to get it back. So you better get going on your
I'll take up the first 20 minutes then. So
I'll split it with you.
Okay. So here we'll have, if I miss anything, feel free to pitch in. So here, this is more of a southern wheat. This is a unleaded to beardless wheat, public variety that we use in the South. One thing that you'd pay attention to if you're looking at the forage aspect of it, the beard trait is linked to the tillering trait. So when you have beardless, you have less tillering than a bearded species. But if you're looking at the hay production or grazing later or something, we kind of want to get away from that beard. And you'll see that with the barleys and stuff of why beards are such a problem when you're grazing in later maturity. But this is something that's more southern variety. I wouldn't say this is a very consistent variety in Nebraska and probably northern Kansas because of this windbreak that we have here, and we see some of that with some species. The SY Monument wheat, that is another forage wheat that we're using. As you can see, we have a lot more tillering than here because it's bearded, but you know, it's kind of talking about that wheat aspect. Again, if you're really looking for biomass, I'm really not for wheat, but you know, there's some guys that we're not confident in using triticales and ryes in their rotation, so you know, that kind of keeps that in mind. So as a grazing aspect, we'll move on down here to the triticales that we're looking at. This is something that we don't have in production yet, but we're looking at the Montech Triticale. It is a beardless triticale, something that's going to be pretty high biomass. I would say if you're looking at rolling a triticale to get something on the ground, this would be really good. I wouldn't say that it's any leafier than the other varieties, even though that it's slightly taller. But if we're also looking at production, say if we're looking at a grain production standpoint, it is standing up pretty good compared to even some of the shorter varieties. So that's something that we like to see. But if you're grazing or you're trying to get that biomass on the ground, that's not such a huge deal. With the fridge triticale, this is a public variety. It's been around for a long time. This and this plot up here did pretty good. It compared very well with 813, which is a protected variety, but that's something that we're going to start running a lot more because that early forage in the South, a lot of guys are after that early forage up to December, where that that 813 really stands out. My plots in Oklahoma, they did, the 813 got around 8 to 10 inches tall, and I'm not going to say that's for everybody, that's going to get that tall, but it definitely outperformed the fridge. But it's been bred for higher biomass, so we're looking at that as more production comes on. But if you're looking at a cheap Triticale, fridge is probably going to be typically your cheapest Triticale to utilize. So, Jay, anything to add on Triticales?
You know, we graze a fair bit of Triticale. We shoot for 2 to 3 grazings. So we come in and top it, move on to the next paddock, give it some recovery time, come back and top it.
Yeah.
Isn't uncommon to get 3 out of it.
Yeah.
In our environment.
Yeah, and Triticale, it's something you can see, you know, it is going to cost more than wheat, you know, especially if you're using like comparing it to like a public wheat variety if you're looking at grazing. But, you know, the reason why we're here today is we're looking at soil health. When we have this extra biomass to work with, we have kind of a buffer of issues of overgrazing. So, and you can see behind yourself how well they laid it down when we got the densities up. How much?
So we'll go ahead and lay it on our hand and balance it, find the midpoint, then you got your eye. So when you come in with your livestock, you got a real good idea that index double height. So it kind of sets your eye. And we've done all the analysis for many years, and probably every species you have out here, and sent in top half, bottom half separately. And your top half is going to have more protein and energy in it, so they're on a higher plane of nutrition. So if you're custom grazing, the goal is going to be pounds of beef per acre, right? And so there's no law against taking that bottom portion, but the nutrition and the gain is going to go down, so you have to recognize that.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into, you know, talking about bricks. Bricks is amino acids, sugars, your micronutrients in your plant. When you're grazing, if you're grazing in the morning versus the afternoon, your bricks will vary throughout the day, and it'll change by climate too, in the conditions. But trying to reach peak bricks will give us the most nutrition for the animal and animal gain. And a lot of people, when they can get to managing where they're moving every day and moving in the afternoon versus moving in the morning, they can gain typically around a ½ pound extra per day, because you're getting that most nutritious plant, part of that plant, and at the right time. So peak photosynthesis, what dictates a lot of the bricks. Plant maturity also dictates a lot of the plant bricks as well.
I have a refractometer along.
Okay.
So
okay. Well, we might play with that a little bit
if you like. We got people that'll watch bricks and 11, 12 o'clock, somewhere's in there, it's probably going to peak. And that's when they're going to move their livestock. Again, there's no law against moving them at 7 in the morning. But if you're moving them daily, think about this a minute now. If you're moving them daily and you move them at 7 in the morning, what are they going to do when they get in that paddock? They're going to graze, right? They're going to fill up. Then they're going to lay down probably in the afternoon, and they're going to chew their cud and relax and do the things that they do. So then you miss the peak. Now if you're coming in there for a week, 10 days, it's maybe not as critical if you came in the morning and the afternoon. But if you're moving daily or moving multiple moves, then all of a sudden it's different. And
remember, when that animal's ruminating, he's also producing more heat. So if he's ruminating in the peak afternoon because he grazed in the morning, he's getting that much more heat load because he's doing that. If you're grazing in the afternoon, he's ruminating towards the evening, he's cooling off a little bit more, and then the next morning, typically, what Alan Williams and a lot of the other guys are trying to get it so they're still a little too hot to rest in the evening, but then they're resting the next morning, and then by 11 o'clock they're ready to roll again. Once they get into that system, you'll see that they work with that system, but the heat tolerance on moving daily can really change that animal's performance. So we'll move down through the species.
In the southern part of the US.
More, yeah. You do it opposite to keep them warm in the winter.
Yeah, we gotta keep them alive.
So this is a Grazeall Triticale. So this is a bearded Triticale. You can see it's not quite as tall as the other species, but it is It does have a few more leaves, even though that it's not as much stem. It's something that we've used kind of as a filler in our system. There are species that we run short of occasionally, so it's something that we have leaned on, and we wanted to compare it in our plots. So Winter Max Triticale is another one. It's what we'd call an unleaded variety, and you can see that it'll have a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch of a beard on there versus your regular bearded. So your unleaded varieties are going to have a shorter beard. Fridge would be considered an unleaded. Your 813 is actually a real beardless. So, and then we have, what is this down here? This is our spring trit. So these are something that we look at. Now these were planted in the fall, and typically, you know, we look at spring species, but Triticale, the spring Triticales particularly, have really good cold tolerance, and we see this pretty consistently without the shelter belt, that they'll overwinter. But spring Triticales don't need the vernalization or that cold period to go reproductive, so they can get planted in the spring or the fall time. If you have like a corn system and you're looking at switching to a grain system and you didn't get anything in the fall, that's where you could be looking in that February to March time frame to be getting a spring Triticale in, because it still has the cold tolerance, but it doesn't necessarily, because some years we warm up in March and we never get cold again. Some years we're cold all the way till May. So this is something that you can look at in that springtime frame, and it does pretty consistently from Nebraska south. I don't know how it would perform in North Dakota, but
do just fine.
Yeah. So it's something that we like to utilize a lot in our spring mixtures, but it does do well in the fall as well. So we're going to get here to our ryes, and rye is the #1 cover crop that's used on a large acre basis, particularly for the corn soybean rotation that's out there. Rye is a hardy plant. It's a dirty word in the South, but it's a very hardy plant. It's something that we can plant late. Now, when you're planting late, I wouldn't always expect the biomass out of it. So it's something that if you're trying to achieve cover, rye is something you can accomplish even when you're planting late. Some years we're warm in December, we can get something started and growing in December in Nebraska, and it's worked pretty well with rye. But this Aroostook Rye Elbon Rye, these are southern variety ryes. The northern rye for us hasn't worked as well in biomass if we're looking at a biomass standpoint. Now up north, the northern rye, that's what they're going to use because it's a lot hardier. But the Elbon and the Aroostook seem to have plenty of winter hardiness for us and achieve a lot of biomass. Some people say they've seen differences between the Aroostook and the Elbon. We haven't really noticed, so we'll run kind of both of them simultaneously. It kind of depends on the region that they got developed in too, because Elbon got developed by the Noble Research Institute in Oklahoma. That's probably the most common one that we run with, but there's some places where the Aroostook got developed before they knew about Elbon or something like that. So we'll see some preferences over the other, but very, very similar in biomass. Rye is something that's going to tolerate a lot more cold or growing point. It's going to grow at the coldest point versus these other cereals. It can grow a couple degrees cooler than your other species, but it's not common, or it's not uncommon for us to plant this in December, January in the South after a really late crop and get it up, you know, by February and still vernalize. So it's something that we really rely on for getting some root mass and getting some weed control. Rye is going to have some of your stronger allelopathy for your weed control. They are working on developing more triticales and wheats for allelopathy for weed suppression. But the allelopathy is leaked out through the roots, and it suppresses the weed at germination. Now, it won't do large seeds. A lot of people are worried about, you know, is it going to affect my crop? Can I plant close? A lot of your large seeds have a lot of stored energy in that seed, so that the more stored energy in that seed allows it to grow through that allelopathy. So corn, soybeans, we typically don't see that problem. There may be some suppression, and that may be more carbon to nitrogen ratio early on, but typically later we'll see it grow out of it. But the allelopathy really affects the germination of small seeded weeds, because small seeded weeds like pigweeds, mare's tail, they need available nitrogen right away, they need available moisture right away, and they need available sunlight. So rye really does a good job of covering that for the early stages, especially your early flushes of pigweeds and mare's tail. So and you can come out here and browse around and look. I mean, you really can't find any other weeds out here. So, but Jay, anything to add on rye? You're doing good, young man. So so Yankee Rye here, this is one that we've kind of developed or came across. It is a little later maturity rye. It's going to be week to 2 weeks later, kind of like your Triticales. Rye is going to be the first to head out, but it's going to turn rank. And you can kind of see over here where the animals grazed, they did more trampling than they did grazing because it turned rank. So once it heads out, it starts losing its quality really fast. Versus a Triticale does keep its quality longer, and wheat and barleys do much better even after they're headed out on quality. It just matters whether it's bearded or not. But the Yankee Rye we've kind of came across, it's a little later maturity, so even if you're wanting that late planting December and get the cold tolerance that you wouldn't get out of a barley or a wheat, and still kind of prolong your grazing season, you can kind of do that with Yankee Rye. So that's something that we're looking at there. And you can see here's the VNS Northern. This plot, it's a little bit shorter, but it's not a huge difference in this plot, but typically on average it's going to produce less than your southern ryes in this region. So next we get into the barleys. Barleys, it depends on where you're at. If you have a high pH, high salt, barleys are a really good option because they tolerate a lot of alkaline soils. We'll see this more towards the mountainous regions that they utilize barley as a grain crop, particularly because of the high pH. So if you're looking at a forage standpoint, barley is really high in forage, but you can see that we run into the beard issue, and they'll break off, but they just cause a lot of issues once they're headed out. So we have to be aware of that. And we are utilizing beardless barleys like we have here. So this is P919. We've ran some other varieties very similar to P919, but you can see that we just don't run into that issue. And you can kind of see behind that they really did graze pretty good on the barleys. They trampled some, but the quality of barley is really nice. Even still after it heads out, it's just whether it has a beard or not. So Saturn Barley, we brought that one in as a forage variety. I don't know if we're going to stick with it or not because we do have the beard on it. But barleys do tiller really good, especially early forage. They're very similar in tillering like oats. For that early biomass, they grow a little faster earlier than your ryes and your triticales and wheats. But that's something we look at. Black Cossack oats, again, this is another one of those species that we are kind of shocked. On average, winter oats, 1-2 times out of 10 that winter oats are going to overwinter in Nebraska. There just hasn't been oats that have been developed for cold tolerance yet. They'll do all right probably 50 miles south of I-70. You can get a lot more consistent. So if you're in that southern part of Kansas, you'll get a lot more consistency. However, if you're looking at early forage up to December, even though that you're knowing that it's going to winter kill, oats will outproduce anything for early forage. So getting some biomass quick can be very important in a mixture. So even though that we lose it in a winter kill scenario, we get some fiber out there, we get some energy out there for those animals to consume. So getting that biomass, rather than having everything 2 to 4 inches all winter long and then all of it being ready at once, we can stagger out our grazing with species like that. But oats, particularly the black oats, are really well known for the root system. The Cossack oats for building soil health. Oats leak probably the most sugars out of all the cereals. So trying to get that biology to come in, getting those sugars, building aggregates in the soil, we really like oats for that. So I wouldn't necessarily rule them out, but it depends on your timing, your goals, and what you're after on whether you utilize oats or not, especially winter oats. You may utilize spring oats more than you would in this region than winter oats, depending on your crop system. So, and then this was just a cereal blend. This is kind of our special deal. This gets run through the cleaner twice. We'll run this every year, but it's typically half the cost. It's predominantly rye because we run a lot of rye, but you'll see some barleys in here, some oats. I don't see a lot of the bearded barley, but there is some beardless barley in here. There's some triticale, but it's something that, you know, if you're looking at a cheap option to get started in covers, or really just trying to get some cover out there, utilizing something like this, we don't necessarily know the percentage of what's what, where we could spike it with a little bit of rye or something like that, but it brings the cost down. So that's something we're starting to do more, especially for guys getting started or wanting to cover a lot of acres. You know, if you're trying to cover all your acres at once and you're not necessarily after grazing, you're after cover, you can utilize something like a cereal blend that would run cheaper. So winter peas here. This is a pretty good plot of winter peas. This is another species that I wouldn't necessarily count on overwintering, except for Polyasa has a really good job of getting them planted deeper, and gets them to overwinter there in Lincoln. But what he's doing, he's planted about 2 to 3 inches deep, getting as many nodes below the soil as possible. So Austrian winter peas is one of our main ones. Wild Winters is another one that we're looking at. Both of them done very well. I know Wild Winters, they're trying to really develop to get them to overwinter. Snow coverage can really affect how well winter peas will overwinter. If we have a very hard and cold winter that's dry, no snow cover, they typically will winter kill a lot harder than, say, if we get a lot of snow cover, get them covered early, they get insulated in the ground from the snow, they can overwinter. But forage wise, peas are really good to add. You can plant winters in the spring, and typically that's how they're produced in Montana, is they plant them early spring. They still will get that vernalization to go reproductive, but they're a lot longer season than a spring pea, so they'll stretch out the full season. If you're looking at planting in the spring, you'd lean more towards a 40-10 spring pea that would grow much quicker and get out of the ground quicker. So, but Jay, do you have anything to add on peas?
No, we haven't had any success with the Austrians, but they sure make a nice complement in the mixture itself.
Yeah.
And so they play a nice role in there.
Yeah, so I agree. We're using a lot of the peas as pollinators too. It's not always about the flower. When we're talking pollinators or insects, there's nectaries on a lot of peas, and they'll have little ports around the leaves and stems where insects can come and get nectar without having to go to the flower. And peas are one of those. Cowpeas have them. There's a lot of other legumes that have those nectary sources for pollinators without actually having a flower that they're going to be utilizing. So we still use the peas quite a bit in our pollinators. So ryegrass, this is something that we commonly use in the south, but the eastern part of the state, in Oklahoma, this is something we like for overseeding warm season pastures where it's higher rainfall. We can broadcast it. If you're utilizing annual ryegrass in a crop production system up here, realize you have a smaller window to getting it terminated, because once it makes a head like this and you still terminate it, it's going to make viable seed, because annual ryegrass has such a huge root system on it that you have less biomass to utilize for your chemical application up here. Annual ryegrass is not going to roll if you're looking at trying to roll versus your cereal rye. So that's one of the downsides of annual ryegrass if you're looking at the rolling and getting around the chemical. But it is a great soil builder, but realize if it's overwintering, you have a smaller window for termination, because once it's headed out, it will make viable seed. Versus where cereal rye gets headed out, it's still in the flowering stage, you can terminate it pretty easily. So Chris, Chris teach out, he does a lot of studies in Iowa. If you have anything to say, I mean, feel free to add what you're doing. He's doing a lot of corn interseeding, so feel free to speak up on any of these species. I know annual ryegrass has been utilized a lot with Dean on looking at interseeding into corn in that V6 stage to try to get something there in the fall. Has annual ryegrass done pretty well in your plots?
Early on, if we evaluated it in the fall, the annual ryegrass was better than the rye.
Better than the rye, yep.
Now, if you looked at it when we had the field day in March, it looked like there was anything there, but it definitely had more biomass above ground.
Yeah, than the rye. And we'll probably, and part of that is annual ryegrass doesn't also need the vernalization. So cereal rye, if it gets seeded in March, and some people use this in orchard, if you seed cereal rye in March, it needs that vernalization. If it doesn't get that vernalization, it'll only stay 6 inches tall all summer long. So where it still may fix that root, but the annual ryegrass would definitely give you that biomass. Grazing wise, annual ryegrass is a great forage. It's really high in sugar content. However, if you have horses, you better be careful because of the high sugar content. That's probably all I have on annual ryegrass. Next we have the vetches, and I really like vetches. Some people hate them, but I really like them because they are another species that's hardy. It's something that I can rely on and be pretty consistent. It just they may come back a couple years, and we're looking at other species that are lower hard dormant seed, and that's what's really going on. Is there's hard dormant seed anywhere from 2 to 5% typically in hairy vetches, so they can come back. If you're in a wheat rotation and you're trying to get around the chemical applications, that's something to take into consideration with vetches, and a lot of clovers are going to have hard dormant seed. So we want to take that into consideration. In a corn soybean, you know, a lot of our chemical applications are taking it out, or it's burning it back to the crown and it's coming back later. So hairy vetch, this is one that we're looking at. This was the AU Merit, so it's an Australian vetch. We're really kind of interested in looking at trying to get this into production because it seems to have more leaves. It also has a lot more blossoms. One thing about your vetches and your peas, most of your nitrogen production is going to be done up until it blooms. Once it starts blooming, your nitrogen production is done. Down here at the end we have woolly pod vetch, and down south when you start getting into Kansas, it can overwinter, but it's not going to be as high biomass, but it's going to bloom about 6 weeks earlier, 4 to 6 weeks earlier than a hairy vetch. So if you're trying to get something in sooner and get all your bang for your buck, you may look at a woolly pod vetch, but it's not going to be as weed suppressing as a regular hairy vetch, so realize that. But if we're staggering species, if we're looking at pollinators, we may want to look at staggering a woolly pod and a hairy vetch to get that blooming all year round, get those predator insects in. Montana hairy vetch is one of our main ones. It's just a VNS variety, but it's produced very well for us. It's done well in the south. It's done well here in Nebraska. And it's something that we'll probably keep running for a while. Purple Bounty hairy vetch is another one. Purple Bounty is one of the earliest blooming of the hairy vetches, but it's still not as early as woolly pod. So, but you really can't tell the difference of woolly pod. If you're looking at planting in the spring, woolly pod will be opposite of this plot right now. If you're planting in the spring, woolly pod will outproduce hairy vetch when planted in the spring, because hairy vetch needs that vernalization. It'll sit there forever, building a root before it goes reproductive, where woolly pod takes off faster. And that's what we see with species that overwinter. Stuff that grows faster doesn't fix its root right away, so it's not going to be as winter hardy. So pay attention if you're trying to get really quick forage out there. Realize that you may be giving up some winter hardiness because it's not putting that energy into that root system first. So that's something that we want to take consideration in grazing plans and cover crop plans of how fast that plant's growing. Is it building a root system for us or not? So that's something we want to look at.
Do you see a difference in the nitrogen production in one variety versus another?
Typically, the more biomass you get in any legume is going to be your higher production in nitrogen. But part of it's going to be tied up in that plant residue as well. We typically say 50-50. 50 is going to be in the soil, 50 is going to be in the plant. In a mixture, it may be different because it may share with the cereals more. But your woolly pod's probably going to produce, if you're planting both of them in the winter, woolly pod's going to produce less nitrogen than the hairy vetch because of biomass. If you plant a woolly pod in the spring than the hairy vetch, the woolly pod's probably going to produce the nitrogen the quickest and the most in the springtime. Unless you let the hairy vetch go all year round or all summer long, and then long term it would outproduce. But typically, the more biomass, peas, spring peas particularly, and winter peas. I know I've seen some really good articles in Kansas of guys utilizing peas. Peas will fix about 75% of their nitrogen in the first 75 to 80 days. Now, it's not going to be as much nitrogen as a hairy vetch can produce, but if you can get 40 pounds, 50 pounds of nitrogen roughly in 70 days, that's pretty good. So I've seen some articles in Kansas of guys utilizing that. So we'll get moving through here. So
Brett, we got like 10 minutes.
Winter lentils. I don't think they really overwintered very well. They'll overwinter down south, but they're going to be lower biomass. They're cheaper per pound than your vetches, but they're going to be lower biomass, lower nitrogen production. And really, I'm more about biomass. Even though you have to pay more, you really get more bang for your buck in the vetches. So, but that's pretty much it for this plot.